The arena laughed when Mason, the reigning middleweight champion, called Ella a simple girl on the wrong stage. He threw his gloves near her feet and told her to mop floors instead of dreaming about a title. Ella said nothing. She lowered her head, damp hair hiding half of her calm face. In the front row, an old man gripped the armrest until his knuckles turned pale. When Mason lunged forward for what he thought was a finishing blow, the old trainer leaned toward an official and whispered one line that changed everything. "Stop laughing now. That is Logan's daughter." The story began inside a packed arena in Chicago, where Mason was holding a promotional appearance before defending his title. He was the kind of champion the cameras adored, handsome, powerful, and dangerously aware of his own popularity. The promoters had arranged a short meet and greet with local fighters so Mason could show off his strength before the main event. Most of the volunteers were eager amateurs hoping for a moment of attention, but Ella was different from the start. She arrived in worn training clothes, her gloves cracked along the seams, with no coach, no entourage, and no one cheering her name. Mason noticed her immediately and decided she would make an easy joke for the crowd. He called her a simple girl who probably thought putting on gloves made her a fighter, and the arena erupted in laughter. Phones rose into the air to capture the moment, and the broadcast crew treated it as harmless entertainment. Ella did not flinch. She kept her eyes on the canvas the way someone does when they have grown used to being dismissed, long before they ever stepped into a ring. Mason tossed his gloves near her feet, daring her to bend down and pick them up like a servant, retrieving something he had dropped. Grace, the league's manager, felt a flicker of discomfort but said nothing, since Mason sold tickets and she could not risk upsetting him before a major fight. In the front row sat an older man with his cap pulled low, his face worn by years no one in the building recognized. People in the boxing world once called him Rocky, a nickname earned from an iron will and an almost impossible ability to absorb punishment without falling. His name was Logan, and as Mason kept mocking the young woman, his hands tightened around the armrest, though he refused to stand. Ella accepted the short sparring exchange, not to prove a point to the crowd, but simply to show she had not wandered into the wrong building by mistake. Mason came at her playfully at first, throwing a heavy punch meant to embarrass her in front of everyone watching. Ella slipped the shot with barely any visible effort, and the punch skimmed harmlessly past her shoulder. For one brief second, the entire arena fell silent, the laughter catching in throats that had been so quick to mock her only moments before. Mason's expression hardened, his pride wounded more than his body. What had started as a joke shifted into something sharper as he threw faster, heavier combinations meant to finally land. Ella still refused to strike back, choosing instead to slip, retreat, and pivot with footwork too precise to belong to an amateur. Logan watched every motion from his seat, recognizing patterns he had spent decades perfecting and had quietly passed down without ever calling it training. Pride and fear rose in him at the same time, because he knew exactly where that instinct had come from. As Mason wound up for what he intended as a finishing blow, Logan leaned toward Carter, a veteran sports reporter seated nearby. He spoke quietly, almost too quietly to hear over the noise of the crowd, telling him to stop laughing because the woman in that ring was his daughter. Carter went still, the color draining from his face as he studied the old man beside him and finally recognized the legend who had vanished from the sport decades earlier. The segment ended with Mason furious that he had failed to land a single clean shot in 30 seconds, his confidence cracking in front of cameras built to capture every second of it. The story rewound several days before that event, back to the worn-out gym in a working-class part of town where Ella spent most of her hours. She mopped the floors, repaired torn heavy bags, restocked gloves, and helped the younger fighters who trained there during the day. She lived quietly, rarely spoke about herself, and never once mentioned the hours she spent training alone after everyone else had gone home. To the fighters who passed through, she was simply the woman who kept the place running, never someone they imagined could step into a real fight. Ella trained late into the night, long after the lights in the front room had been switched off and the building had gone quiet. She had no certified coach, only a collection of old notebooks filled with technique, a handful of worn training tapes, and fragments of guidance she had pieced together from a man who never called himself her teacher. That man was Logan, the gym's quiet caretaker, a figure most people assumed was simply an old fighter who once knew a little about the sport. He kept his distance from her deliberately, never letting warmth slip into anything resembling a father's affection. Ella had no idea Logan was her real father. She only knew him as someone who had helped her mother through hard times long ago, a kindness she never thought to question. Her mother had passed away years earlier, leaving behind a small necklace and a single unclear sentence that Ella had carried with her ever since, a warning not to hate the man who left before he understood the truth. She had asked Logan about her father many times growing up, and every time he found a way to avoid the question entirely. Logan taught her how to stand, how to breathe, how to absorb pain without letting it break her composure, but he never allowed himself to call any of it formal training. He feared that if Ella ever stepped into professional boxing, the same people who had destroyed his career would eventually turn their attention toward her. Ella, however, saw boxing as the only real path out of a life where she had always been overlooked and underestimated by everyone around her. One afternoon, Grace arrived at the gym searching for a local fighter willing to appear in Mason's promotional event. No one wanted to volunteer, since Mason had a reputation for hitting far too hard during these supposedly friendly appearances. Ella signed up without hesitation, surprising everyone in the room including herself. Logan objected immediately, warning her that she was not ready to face someone who fought not to win cleanly but to break people down in front of an audience. Ella answered quietly that she had been broken many times before in her life, the only difference now being that no one had ever witnessed it happen. Logan saw the unshakable resolve behind her words and fell silent, unable to argue against something so familiar to his own past. He refused to formally approve of her decision, yet he could not bring himself to stop her either. That night, Ella wrapped her own hands in front of a cracked mirror, focused and steady, while Logan stood just outside the door, silently aching at how closely her reflection mirrored the man he had once been before everything fell apart. Carter began piecing together Logan's identity the moment he heard that single whispered sentence at the arena. Years earlier, Logan had been an undefeated fighter, widely predicted to become one of the greatest symbols boxing had ever produced. The nickname Rocky had not come from any official title, but from fans who marveled at how often he rose after knockdowns that should have ended any ordinary fighter's night. His career collapsed after a controversial bout against a fighter managed by a powerful figure named Sebastian, a match that ended with accusations no one ever fully proved. Logan was accused of using banned substances, fixing the outcome, and striking an official after the final bell, claims the media seized upon without ever waiting for solid evidence. Sebastian benefited the most from the scandal, quickly absorbing major contracts and building the very empire that now controlled much of professional boxing. Logan disappeared without filing a lawsuit or offering a single public defense, a silence the world mistook for guilt rather than sacrifice. The truth was far different, rooted in a threat made against the woman he loved at the time, Ella's mother. When Sebastian learned she was carrying his child, he forced Logan into signing a confidentiality agreement under threat that speaking out would drag the woman he loved into danger and public ruin. Logan chose to vanish entirely, believing it was the only way to protect both her and the baby she carried. He did not even know Ella had been born healthy until many years later, long after the damage to his name had already become permanent in the public record. By the time he found her, her mother was already gravely ill and reluctant to burden Ella with the weight of Logan's tarnished past. Logan promised to protect Ella quietly from a distance, refusing to claim her as his daughter until he believed she would be truly safe from the people who had once destroyed him. What began as a promise meant to shield her slowly turned into an emotional prison that trapped them both in years of unspoken truth. Carter still held an old folder of research on Logan, having always suspected the scandal had been engineered rather than earned. When he heard Logan call Ella his daughter, he understood instantly that this sparring match could reopen a story buried for over 2 decades. Carter opened an old recorder he had kept for years, murmuring quietly to himself that a truth long buried had finally found its way back into the ring where it all began. He thought of the countless nights he had spent chasing leads on Logan's downfall, only to be turned away by witnesses too frightened to speak on record. Sebastian's reach had always extended far beyond the ropes, touching officials, sponsors, and even the journalists who once dared to ask uncomfortable questions. Carter had filed the story away as unfinished business, certain that somewhere a piece was missing that would finally make sense of it all. Watching Ella move in that ring, he realized the missing piece had been training in a forgotten gym the entire time, unaware of the storm her existence was about to unleash. Back in the arena, Mason grew visibly frustrated as Ella continued slipping every punch he threw with calm precision. At first, the crowd assumed he was simply drawing out the moment for entertainment, stretching the promotional segment for extra excitement. But his expression told a different story as his jaw tightened, his eyes reddened with irritation, and his breathing grew heavier with every missed swing. Ella still refused to counter with any real force, focused entirely on reading the rhythm of his movement rather than proving anything to the people watching. She relied on small steps, subtle shoulder shifts, and slight tilts of her head that caused Mason's punches to slide harmlessly past her. Logan sat below, watching every motion with a mixture of pride and quiet fear he could not fully hide. Mason aimed a strike dangerously close to the back of her neck, a move far too aggressive for what was supposed to be a friendly exhibition. Grace rose immediately, intending to stop the segment, but Sebastian signaled for her to remain seated and let it continue. Sebastian studied Ella with growing suspicion, recognizing the same defensive footwork Logan had once made famous, now appearing in a stranger's careful movements. Mason threw a powerful left hook, and Ella finally had no choice but to respond. She landed a short jab against the center of his chest, light in force but perfectly timed, enough to make the champion stumble for a single stunned beat. The entire arena fell into a stunned hush. A woman the crowd had been laughing at minutes earlier had just thrown the champion off his rhythm in front of everyone watching. Mason's composure shattered, and he charged forward without restraint or strategy. Ella slipped to her right and landed a counter to his ribs, dropping him halfway to one knee in front of the cameras. The crowd surged to its feet, laughter transforming instantly into shocked disbelief. Mason rose quickly, pretending he had simply lost his footing, though his face had gone pale with humiliation. Sebastian immediately called an end to the exhibition, insisting the promotional purpose had already been served. Ella removed her gloves without celebration, without taunting, without a single word of triumph. Mason leaned close to her ear and warned that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Ella simply answered that she had not come to embarrass him, since he had already managed that on his own. Logan slipped away before reporters could recognize him, while Sebastian stared after him with a flicker of alarm spreading across his face. Carter remained behind, scribbling notes faster than he had in years, sensing that the footage everyone else treated as a viral curiosity was something far larger. He had spent 2 decades wondering whether Logan's name would ever surface again, and now it had returned through the most unlikely vessel imaginable. The cameras around him kept replaying Mason's stumble in slow motion, oblivious to the deeper story unfolding just beyond their lenses. For Carter, the exhibition was no longer a footnote to a champion's promotional tour, but the opening line of a story he had waited half his career to finish. Footage of Ella stunning Mason spread rapidly across every sports outlet within hours of the event. Headlines called her the cleaning woman who staggered a champion in under a minute, framing the moment as both shocking and irresistible. Mason's reputation as an unbeatable fighter took a visible hit, and his team scrambled to control the narrative before it spiraled further out of their grasp. They quickly accused Ella of playing dirty, claiming she had deliberately sabotaged a harmless promotional appearance for attention she did not deserve. Sebastian shaped the story into a full scandal, painting Ella as an unknown opportunist exploiting a public stage to manufacture instant fame. Reporters surrounded the old gym, eager for a quote, a reaction, anything that could be twisted into a headline. Ella was unfamiliar with that kind of attention and had no idea how to respond, and her silence only invited further distortion of who she really was. Logan urged her to avoid the press entirely, but Ella feared that hiding would only let Mason win through words instead of fists. Grace visited Ella privately, admitting she felt enormous pressure to protect Mason's image regardless of what she had personally witnessed in that ring. She also confessed she had seen something real in Ella, a level of skill too rare to dismiss as mere luck. Grace proposed a small official match, one without a title on the line, simply meant to settle the growing public dispute once and for all. Logan strongly objected, certain Sebastian would never allow a fair contest to take place under his control. Ella asked Logan why he always acted as though she had no right to choose her own path forward. Logan nearly told her the truth in that moment, but stopped himself just before the words could leave his mouth. His silence wounded her more deeply than any argument could have. Mason, meanwhile, wanted the match to happen, desperate to defeat Ella publicly and restore the reputation she had damaged. Sebastian agreed to the match, but quietly stacked the conditions against her, choosing a familiar referee, demanding excessive medical screening for Ella alone, and ensuring the coverage favored Mason from the very beginning. Carter began digging deeper into Sebastian's history, searching for old documents connected to Logan's downfall years earlier. Ella signed the contract to fight, while Logan stared at her signature as though watching a door from his past swing open far wider than he had ever prepared himself for. That night, he sat alone in the gym long after Ella had gone home, replaying old fights in his mind that no broadcast had aired in over 20 years. He remembered the roar of crowds that once chanted his name and the silence that followed when they decided to believe the worst about him instead. Watching his daughter step toward the same spotlight filled him with a dread he could not fully explain to her, not yet, not without breaking a promise he had carried for most of her life. He understood now that protecting her with silence had only led the moment when the past would demand to be faced. While preparing for the upcoming match, Ella discovered an old box tucked away in the gym's storage closet. Inside were recordings of Logan's old fights, photographs with a woman's face deliberately cut away, and a small handkerchief embroidered with her mother's initials. She watched the recordings closely and recognized the same footwork Logan had quietly taught her over the years, movement too specific to be coincidence. Suspicion began forming that the connection between Logan and her mother ran far deeper than anything she had been told. When she confronted him directly, Logan still refused to admit he was her father, only saying he owed her mother an apology he had never been able to deliver. Ella's anger surfaced sharply, the weight of a lifetime surrounded by half-finished sentences finally becoming too heavy to carry quietly. Logan tried to explain that boxing was never only about the ring, but also about money, power, and people willing to destroy entire families to protect their own interests. Ella answered that he could not protect her by turning her into someone who did not even know who she truly was. The argument widened the distance between them rather than closing it. Carter met privately with Ella and handed her an old newspaper clipping detailing Logan's career before the scandal. For the first time, Ella learned that Logan had once been a legend whose career was deliberately destroyed by forces far larger than a single bad fight. She saw the nickname Rocky printed across the page, and finally understood that the whisper from the arena had never been a random phrase at all. Carter did not say outright that Logan was her father, but he gently suggested her mother had been the only person who ever truly believed Logan was innocent. Ella returned to the gym that night, pulling on her gloves and striking the heavy bag until her knuckles split and bled. Logan appeared and wrapped her hands the way he had done countless times before, his movements practiced and familiar. Ella finally asked him the one question she had carried her entire life, demanding to know who he had truly been to her mother. Logan could no longer avoid the truth. He admitted he had loved her mother deeply and that he had failed her by choosing to stay away when staying close mattered most. Ella stared at him, the truth nearly within reach, waiting only for the final words she had not yet heard him say. She walked home alone through quiet streets, the handkerchief from the box still folded in her pocket like a fragment of a story she had not yet finished reading. Every memory of her mother's vague warnings now seemed to point toward the same man who had spent years standing quietly beside her without ever claiming his place. She wondered how many other pieces of her life had been shaped by secrets she never knew existed, hidden behind ordinary kindness and careful distance. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder not whether Logan was her father, but why the answer had taken this long to find her. The official match between Ella and an opponent chosen by Sebastian took place just before Mason's main event. Her opponent was an experienced fighter, older and hardened, hired specifically to wear Ella down and injure her before she ever had a chance to face Mason directly. Mason sat in the front row, smirking with confidence, certain Ella would be thoroughly outclassed within minutes. Logan stood in her corner but kept his expression carefully controlled, refusing to let his emotions show too clearly in front of the cameras. Ella walked into the ring under a wave of jeers, since the press had already painted her as someone chasing attention rather than respect. In the opening round, her opponent grabbed, shoved, and struck behind her head repeatedly, violations the referee seemed determined to overlook. Ella's eyebrow split open from one particularly rough exchange, yet she kept her breathing controlled and steady throughout. Logan wanted to stop the fight, but Ella looked toward him and shook her head firmly, refusing to give up so easily. By the second round, Ella began reading the rhythm of her opponent's dishonest tactics with growing clarity. Rather than answering with similar tactics, she relied on clean technique to dismantle every attempt to close the distance unfairly. The crowd's hostility slowly shifted as they watched her absorb punishment without a single complaint. In the third round, Ella landed a beautiful combination that sent her opponent crashing to the canvas, and the entire arena erupted with sudden excitement. The referee, however, counted slowly and then deducted points from Ella, claiming she had struck after the bell despite clear evidence to the contrary. The controversial decision robbed her of a victory that everyone in the building had clearly witnessed. The result was declared a draw, even though most observers believed Ella had earned the win outright. Mason laughed loudly, telling her she simply did not belong on a real stage. Ella began walking away in silence, but Logan stepped forward and placed himself directly between her and Mason. He said nothing, threw no punches, only stared at Mason with an intensity that silenced his entire team instantly. Sebastian realized in that moment that Logan had truly returned, and the realization unsettled him deeply. Carter recorded the referee's questionable decision in detail and began preparing an investigative piece exposing what had happened. Logan turned to Ella and told her that, starting that day, she would never train alone again. Backstage, away from the cameras, Ella finally allowed her shoulders to sag under the exhaustion of the fight and the disappointment of the stolen decision. Logan pressed a cool towel against her split eyebrow, his hands steady despite the storm of memories the night had clearly stirred in him. He told her quietly that he had once lost a fight the very same way, robbed by people who feared what an honest result might cost them. For the first time, Ella saw something other than distance in his eyes, something that looked very much like a father finally allowing himself to worry out loud. Logan officially began training Ella, though his methods were far from gentle. He rebuilt her fundamentals from the ground up, focusing on breathing, stance, distance control, and managing fear under pressure. Ella possessed natural stamina and instinct, but she lacked experience against opponents who fought with psychological tactics rather than pure skill. Logan repeatedly warned her that Mason's true danger lay not in his punches, but in his ability to provoke an opponent into losing composure entirely. During their sessions, Ella kept pressing Logan about his past, refusing to let the subject rest. Logan tried to maintain distance, yet every small act of care made the truth increasingly difficult to deny. Carter eventually brought fresh evidence forward, a copy of the old confidentiality agreement bearing Sebastian's signature alongside a clause threatening Logan's loved ones directly. Ella saw her mother's name buried within those documents and finally understood that her mother had not simply been abandoned the way she once assumed. Logan finally admitted the truth outright, confirming he was Ella's biological father. Ella did not cry immediately. She stepped back instead, as though struck by a blow she had never managed to see coming in time. She asked how he could have remained close to her for years without ever speaking the truth aloud. Logan admitted he had convinced himself that silence was protection, when in reality it had only been fear disguised carefully as love. Ella's anger spilled out openly, telling him he had stolen her right to know exactly where she truly belonged. Logan accepted every word without defending himself, offering no excuses to soften the weight of what he had done. He told her that if she wanted him gone from her corner entirely, he would leave without protest. Ella did not answer him right away, the silence stretching long between them. That night she watched old recordings of Logan, young and proud, followed by footage of the media tearing his name apart piece by piece. She realized she was no longer only fighting Mason, but also fighting the shadow that had crushed her father long before she was ever born. The next morning, she returned to the gym and called Logan her trainer, though she still could not bring herself to call him anything more. Logan understood the small gesture was the narrowest opening he had been given, yet it remained the most meaningful one of his life. The two of them began their first session together as something resembling a real team. The morning light cut through the dusty windows of the gym as Logan called out instructions in the clipped, focused tone of a man rebuilding something he thought he had lost forever. Ella moved through the drills with renewed intensity, no longer training only to prove herself to strangers, but to understand the man standing across from her. Neither spoke of forgiveness yet, but something had shifted in the rhythm between them, a wary trust beginning to take the place of years of careful distance. For the first time since she could remember, Ella felt as though she was not training alone, even in the moments when Logan said nothing at all. When Carter published his first investigative piece, Sebastian responded immediately and aggressively. He denied every accusation, calling Logan a washed-up failure exploiting his own daughter to chase relevance he no longer deserved. Mason held a press conference of his own, mocking Ella publicly as the flawed legacy of a fraudulent legend. The insult struck directly at the wound Ella carried most deeply inside her. Ella nearly lost her composure in front of the cameras, but Logan held her steady before she could react. He told her that if she fought Mason out of pure anger, she would be fighting inside his match entirely on his terms. If she fought instead from a place of truth, she would pull Mason into a fight that belonged to her alone. Sebastian leaned on his connections to pressure Grace, demanding she cancel any possibility of a rematch entirely. Grace found herself caught between protecting her own career and protecting the basic fairness of the league she had sworn to uphold. Carter tracked down a former medical worker who had been present during Logan's original testing years earlier. The man admitted that Logan's sample appeared to have been tampered with, though fear had kept him silent for decades. When Sebastian learned of this development, he sent people to intimidate Carter directly. Without depicting graphic violence, the message was unmistakable, as Carter's car was vandalized and his private files were ransacked overnight. Ella wanted to withdraw from the match entirely to protect everyone around her from further harm. Logan told her that retreating would never make Sebastian stop, since his entire power depended on keeping people too afraid to stand firm. Grace eventually decided to announce a special match, granting Ella the chance to face Mason in a bout without a title at stake, broadcast nationally under an independent oversight panel. Mason agreed instantly, his pride too wounded to refuse, confident he could defeat Ella quickly and erase the embarrassment from the public record. Sebastian remained displeased but understood he could no longer back away with the public already watching closely. A fight poster soon rose into view across the city, Mason facing Ella beneath cold arena lights, while Logan stood quietly behind her like a ghost from the past, finally returning to claim its place. In the days that followed, the announcement spread quickly across every sports outlet, with analysts debating whether Ella's earlier showing had been a genuine threat or a brief stroke of luck against a distracted champion. Grace fielded calls from sponsors nervous about the league's sudden exposure to scandal, yet she refused to back down from the oversight panel she had insisted upon. Sebastian quietly began searching for new ways to tilt the outcome in Mason's favor, unwilling to leave anything to chance after watching his control slip further with each passing day. Logan, for his part, spent his evening studying footage of Mason's recent fights long after Ella had gone home, determined that this time nothing would be left unprepared. Ella spent the final night before the match inside the old gym, unable to sleep. Her fear was not centered on Mason, but on the possibility that losing would bury the truth about Logan all over again. Logan offered her his old training robe, though Ella hesitated before accepting it. He explained that the robe was not meant to make her carry his name, but to remind her that even someone who once fell completely could still leave something good behind. Ella asked him if he had ever regretted choosing silence over the truth. Logan admitted he regretted it every single day, though the deepest pain was never the lost championship, but the years he had missed simply being her father. For the first time, Ella softened slightly, though forgiveness still remained far from complete. She told him that regardless of the outcome of the match, they would finally tell the whole truth about her mother once it was over. Logan agreed without hesitation. Carter arrived with important news, revealing that the former medical worker had agreed to testify publicly if Ella survived the media storm certain to follow the match. Grace quietly confirmed that the independent oversight panel would be fully present and watching closely. Meanwhile, Mason trained inside a lavish facility filled with cameras and admirers eager to capture every moment of his preparation. Despite the attention, Mason could not find his usual calm, haunted by the memory of being stunned in front of the entire arena weeks earlier. Sebastian pushed him relentlessly, demanding a swift and decisive knockout to erase any doubt about his dominance. Mason slowly began to understand that he was no longer just defending his own reputation, but propping up Sebastian's entire fragile empire of deception. Ella finally slipped on Logan's old robe and walked out of the gym just as the first light of morning began to rise. The fabric still smelled faintly of leather and chalk, a scent that seemed to carry decades of unspoken history inside its worn seams. As she walked the empty streets toward the arena, Ella thought about every moment she had once believed herself invisible, every quiet humiliation she had absorbed without complaint. She realized that none of those moments had been wasted, since each one had quietly built the patience she would need for what was coming. Logan walked a few steps behind her, saying nothing, simply allowing her to carry the morning in silence the way she needed to. Inside the arena, technicians tested lighting rigs and broadcast crews ran through final checks, unaware that two fighters were arriving with very different reasons for being there. Mason's camp projected confidence through every interview and every camera angle, yet beneath the surface his doubt had begun eating away at the certainty he once wore so easily. Sebastian paced near the entrance, reviewing contracts and contingency plans, determined that no outcome would slip beyond his control again. Grace stood near the oversight panel, double-checking every detail of the broadcast to ensure nothing could later be dismissed as biased or incomplete. Carter settled into the press section early, his recorder already running, certain that whatever happened that night would close a chapter that had remained open for 23 years. The arena filled to capacity with national broadcasters covering every angle of the long-awaited match. The air inside buzzed with anticipation, every seat occupied by people who had followed the story through weeks of headlines, accusations, and speculation. Ella walked out first, met by a mixture of jeers and scattered cheers from a crowd still uncertain what to believe about her. She no longer dressed like someone playing the role of a victim, yet she kept the same quiet, unassuming presence that had always defined her. Logan stood in her corner, his expression calm on the surface but filled with emotion just beneath it. Mason entered like royalty, his championship belt resting on his shoulder, surrounded by a large and confident entourage. He made a point of walking close to Ella, telling her that tonight she would finally understand why simple women had no place in a champion's world. Ella said nothing in return. The opening round began with Mason attacking aggressively, eager to end the contest before it could develop into anything resembling a real fight. Ella focused on defense, studying the rhythm of his footwork and the tension building in his shoulders. Mason won the first round through sheer pressure, and many in the crowd assumed Ella was simply trying to survive rather than compete. Logan reminded her quietly between rounds that Mason was throwing wild punches out of anger rather than strategy. In the second round, Ella began answering with sharp jabs and well-placed shots to the body. Mason grew visibly frustrated that she refused to fall apart under his pressure. Sebastian, watching from a private section, signaled for Mason to fight dirtier. Mason began using his shoulder and elbow during close exchanges, but the independent panel noticed and recorded each violation carefully this time. Grace watched intently, recognizing that the match was slipping entirely beyond Sebastian's careful planning. Each time Mason tried to bend the rules, the panel's quiet notations chipped away at the advantage Sebastian had once guaranteed him, and the broadcast cameras caught every subtle infraction for a national audience to judge for themselves. In the third round, Mason landed a heavy blow that sent Ella crashing to the canvas. The arena exploded into noise, thousands of voices rising at once in a wave of shock and disbelief. Logan wanted to shout but held himself back, simply telling her in a steady voice that she knew exactly how to rise again. Ella lay on the canvas for a moment, hearing the count, remembering every instance she had been mocked, remembering her mother, remembering Logan's long silence. Somewhere beneath the ringing in her ears, she heard the echo of every quiet night she had spent training alone, certain that no one was watching or believed she mattered. She rose to her feet at the count of 9. Mason looked stunned that his hardest punch had failed to finish her. In the fourth round, Ella shifted her rhythm entirely, drawing on the same style of absorbing punishment and countering that had once defined Logan's legendary career. Carter recognized it instantly as a cleaner, calmer version of the legend he remembered from decades earlier. Ella landed a perfect counter that sent Mason stumbling backward, off balance for the first time all night. The crowd began turning in her favor, chanting her name louder with every passing second. Mason, humiliated and furious, charged forward recklessly. Ella no longer retreated. She stood firmly in the center of the ring and looked directly at him without fear. From his corner, Logan said quietly that this moment was not for him but for her alone, and somehow Ella heard him clearly despite the noise surrounding them. In the final round, Mason gathered every remaining ounce of strength for one decisive knockout attempt. Ella read the shift in his left shoulder, slipped half a step aside, and answered with a perfect three-punch combination to the body, the chin, and the temple. Mason collapsed to the canvas. The referee began counting, and this time no one could interfere with the outcome. Mason failed to rise in time. Ella had won by a clean knockout. The arena fell silent for one full second before erupting into overwhelming noise. Ella did not celebrate excessively, choosing instead to walk calmly back toward her corner and look at Logan directly. Tears filled his eyes, not because of the victory itself, but because his daughter had finally stood in that ring under the weight of her own name and nothing else. Cameras swarmed the edge of the ring, desperate for the first reaction from either fighter, but Ella simply lowered her gloves and let the moment settle quietly around her. Mason's team rushed to his side, stunned that the champion they had built an entire empire around now lay motionless on the same canvas where he once mocked her for daring to dream. Sebastian rose from his seat and slipped toward the exit, his expression unreadable, though those closest to him recognized the early signs of panic. Grace exhaled slowly, the weight of weeks of pressure finally easing from her shoulders as the broadcast cut to a wide shot of the entire arena chanting Ella's name. Carter lowered his recorder for the first time all night, watching the scene with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally seen a long-delayed reckoning arrive exactly where it belonged. After the match, Sebastian attempted to leave the arena quietly, but reporters blocked every exit before he could disappear. Flashbulbs surrounded him as questions poured in faster than he could deflect them, each one chipping away at the composed image he had spent years perfecting. Carter revealed his new evidence right there at the press conference, presenting the old confidentiality agreement, the signs of a tampered test sample, and the testimony of the former medical worker who had finally agreed to speak. Grace confirmed publicly that the league would open an independent investigation into Sebastian and the matches he had long been suspected of manipulating. Mason, having lost the fight that was supposed to restore his reputation, could no longer hide behind the image his team had carefully built around him. He tried briefly to shift the blame entirely onto Sebastian, but the crowd had already witnessed his arrogance and his willingness to fight dishonestly when pressure mounted against him. Logan was asked directly why he had remained silent for so many years. He refused to play the role of a victim, admitting plainly that he had been wrong to believe disappearing was the only way to protect the people he loved. Ella stood beside him but did not allow him to speak entirely on her behalf. She told the room that she had not won to seek revenge against Mason, but to reclaim her right to step into a ring without being defined by other people's contempt. When a reporter asked whether she truly was Logan's daughter, Ella answered simply that she was, but that she was also still entirely herself. That single sentence quickly became the most repeated moment from the entire night. Logan's name began to be cleared gradually, not through any sudden miracle, but through the careful process of an investigation finally being allowed to move forward. Sebastian lost control of the league's operations while the inquiry continued, his influence crumbling far faster than he had ever imagined possible. People who had once feared his reach now spoke openly to investigators, eager to finally unburden themselves of secrets they had carried for years. Grace took the opportunity to reform much of the sport's structure, working to give fairer opportunities to fighters who lacked large teams or powerful connections. Carter finished his long-awaited feature, telling the story of a man who lost everything and the daughter who reclaimed the truth inside the very ring that once tried to silence them both. The piece spread quickly, not because of scandal alone, but because people recognized something honest in a story that refused to flatter anyone involved. Ella eventually returned to the same worn-out gym where her entire journey had quietly begun. She hung her first cracked pair of gloves on the wall, not as a symbol of poverty or struggle, but as proof of exactly where she had started and how far she had traveled since then. Logan walked in hesitantly, asking if he could still stand in her corner for whatever fight came next. Ella paused for a long moment before answering, telling him he could remain there, but only if he never hid anything from her again. Logan agreed without hesitation, relief and gratitude visible in every line of his face. Forgiveness did not arrive completely in a single night, but a door toward healing had finally opened between them. They spoke for hours that evening, filling in years of missing context about her mother, about the choices Logan had made, and about the quiet sacrifices neither of them had fully understood until now. Ella asked questions she had cared for most of her life, and for the first time, Logan answered every single one without flinching or retreating into careful half-truths. The conversation did not erase the years they had lost, but it gave them something steadier to build upon going forward. The story closed with father and daughter walking into a quiet morning training session, together, sunlight spilling gently through the gym's old windows. There was no more mocking laughter, no more secrets pressing down on either of them. There was only the steady sound of gloves striking the heavy bag, the rhythm of feet moving across worn wooden floors, and a woman once dismissed by everyone around her now preparing for whatever came next under the simple weight of her own name. Logan watched from the edge of the ring, no longer hiding behind a low cap or a borrowed silence, finally present as exactly who he was. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of how much had changed inside that small, unremarkable building. Yet within those walls, an old wound had finally begun, slowly and honestly, to close. If you want to know why Logan hid the truth from his daughter for years, stay until the final bell.